My name is Sloane Mitchell. I'm 28, and I learned the hardest lesson about family loyalty when my parents called me for the first time in 3 years. Not to apologize, not to reconnect, but to ask for $39,000. The kicker, they only found out I had money because my cousin posted a photo of my downtown condo on Instagram tagging me in it. Suddenly, the daughter they'd written off as the disappointment became their golden ticket. But what they didn't know was that I'd been planning my response to their inevitable return for years, and when they finally came crawling back, I was ready to serve them a dish of justice they'd never forget. Hey everyone! Before we dive into this wild family drama, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? If you're ready for a story about family betrayal that'll make your jaw drop, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because trust me, you're going to want to see how this revenge unfolds. And stick around because the way this ends, pure karma gold. Growing up in the Mitchell household meant living in the shadow of my older brother Derek. From the moment he could walk, Derek was the golden child who could do no wrong. When he scored average grades, it was amazing effort. When I brought home straight A's, it was expected. When Derek played mediocre high school football, Dad never missed a game screaming from the sidelines like his son was heading to the NFL. When I made varsity debate team and won state championships, they were too busy at Derek's practices to attend my competitions. The favoritism wasn't subtle, it was glaring, painful, and constant. Christmas mornings meant Derek unwrapping the latest gaming console designer clothes and sports equipment, while I received practical gifts like socks and school supplies. When Derek crashed Dad's car at 16, they bought him a newer one and laughed it off as boys being boys. When I asked to borrow Mom's car for prom, I had to write a 3-page essay explaining why I deserved the privilege and sign a contract promising to pay for any damages. College applications revealed the depth of their bias. Derek's mediocre SAT scores and C-average GPA somehow warranted a $40,000 a year private university, complete with fraternity dues and a monthly allowance. Meanwhile, my near-perfect scores and academic scholarships were met with, well, Sloane's always been the smart one. She'll figure it out. They contributed exactly $0 to my education, claiming they'd already spent their college fund on Derek's once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I worked 3 jobs through college, tutoring, waiting tables, and doing freelance graphic design, while Derek partied his way through his expensive education. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in computer science, they attended Derek's graduation ceremony instead, saying his was more important because he was struggling academically and needed their support. The breaking point came during my senior year when I landed a prestigious internship at a tech startup. I was so excited to share the news, practically vibrating with pride as I called home. Mom answered with her usual distracted tone, barely listening as I explained how competitive the position was and how it could launch my career. Halfway through my explanation, she interrupted me. "That's nice, honey. Listen, Derek needs us to co-sign a loan for a new truck. His old one broke down, and he can't get to work without reliable transportation. Can you call back later? We're at the dealership." That phone call crystallized everything wrong with our family dynamic. Derek, who had dropped out of college junior year and was working part-time at a sporting goods store, received immediate financial assistance and emotional support. Meanwhile, I was achieving actual success, building a real career, and my parents couldn't spare 5 minutes to celebrate with me. The emotional neglect went beyond just achievements and money. It was about fundamental love and attention. Derek called them constantly, often drunk or in trouble, and they'd drop everything to help him. I could go months without hearing from them, and when I did call, conversations were brief and superficial. They knew nothing about my life, my friends, my goals, or my struggles. I was essentially an only child, masquerading as part of a family that had already decided I didn't matter. After graduation, I moved across the country for my job, partly for the opportunity, but mostly to escape the constant reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. I stopped calling as frequently, stopped visiting for holidays, and gradually realized they didn't notice my absence. The phone worked both ways, but apparently only Derek was worth reaching out to. Moving to Seattle felt like emerging from underwater and finally being able to breathe. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued intelligence, innovation, and hard work, the exact qualities my family had always overlooked. My internship turned into a full-time position at a rapidly growing fintech startup where my ability to solve complex problems and write elegant code quickly caught the attention of senior developers. Within 6 months, I was promoted to senior software engineer. Within a year, I was leading my own team. The company was riding the wave of digital payment solutions, and my algorithms for fraud detection were saving them millions annually. My salary jumped from decent to impressive to absolutely incredible as headhunters began circling with offers from major tech companies. But the real game changer came when I noticed inefficiencies in our internal project management system. Working nights and weekends, I developed a comprehensive solution that streamlined workflow across multiple departments. When I presented it to the executive team, they didn't just approve it, they fast-tracked it for patent filing and offered me equity in the spin-off company we created around my innovation. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Derek was calling my parents for bail money after another DUI incident, I was getting calls from venture capitalists interested in licensing my technology. While he was moving back into their basement for the third time, I was house hunting in one of the most expensive cities in America. I bought my condo with cash, a stunning 2-bedroom unit in downtown Seattle with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. The mortgage broker initially assumed I was making a joint purchase with a spouse. Incredulous that a 26-year-old was buying a $700,000 property outright. The interior design process became my therapy, carefully selecting every piece of furniture, every painting, every detail that reflected my personality and success. The financial security I'd built extended far beyond the condo. My investment portfolio was diversified and growing. My emergency fund could cover 2 years of expenses, and my retirement accounts were already substantial. I'd become everything my parents had never expected me to be: wealthy, successful, and completely independent. Yet through all these achievements, the silence from my family remained deafening. I'd sent them my new address when I bought the condo more out of obligation than hope. No congratulations call came. No request for photos or details about my new life. Derek's latest arrest and subsequent court fees dominated their attention and their conversations based on the rare updates I received from extended family members. The emotional distance I'd created was both protective and painful. Part of me wanted to call them to share my excitement about my successes, to hear pride in their voices for once. But experience had taught me that my achievements would either be minimized or immediately overshadowed by whatever crisis Derek had created. So I celebrated my victories alone, surrounded by friends who appreciated my accomplishments, but couldn't fill the family-shaped hole in my heart. My cousin Rebecca, one of the few family members I still spoke to occasionally, would sometimes ask why I never mentioned my parents in social media posts or conversations. I'd learned to deflect with vague responses about being busy or living far away, but the truth was simpler and more painful. They'd never shown interest in my life, so I'd stopped including them in it. The technology sector's rapid growth meant my wealth was accelerating faster than I'd ever imagined possible. Stock options were vesting, consulting opportunities were multiplying, and my patent royalties were generating passive income. I was living a life that would have been unimaginable during those college years, when I was eating ramen and working multiple jobs just to survive. 3 years of blissful silence ended on a Tuesday morning when my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in months. Rebecca's voice was excited and slightly breathless as she gushed about my amazing place and how successful I'd become. Confused, I asked what prompted this sudden enthusiasm for my living situation, which led to her explaining the Instagram post she'd made the night before. She'd been visiting Seattle for a work conference and had stopped by my condo for dinner. Apparently, the view from my living room with the Space Needle glittering in the distance and the Sounds waters reflecting the city lights was too stunning not to share. Her post included multiple photos of my interior design, the panoramic view, and a casual caption about staying with my incredibly successful cousin in her gorgeous downtown condo. You know, family dynamics are wild, aren't they? Here I was thinking my story was just about parental favoritism, but it's really about how money changes everything in families. If you're relating to this story of being the forgotten child until suddenly you're needed, hit that like button. I have a feeling you're going to love where this is heading. What Rebecca didn't realize was that my parents followed her on social media, along with most of our extended family. Her innocent post had effectively announced to everyone that the daughter they'd written off as the practical one was apparently doing quite well for herself. The geometric patterns of my expensive rugs, the designer furniture, the view that screamed expensive real estate, it all painted a picture of success they'd never imagined I could achieve. The first sign something had shifted came from my Aunt Linda, who called that afternoon, asking pointed questions about my career in computers and whether I was seeing anyone special. These weren't casual family check-ins. They were intelligence-gathering missions disguised as concern. By evening, my cousin Marcus had messaged asking if I needed help managing my investments, and my Uncle Pete wondered if I had any business advice for his struggling restaurant. But the call I'd been unconsciously waiting for my entire adult life came the next morning. Mom's voice was artificially bright with that forced cheerfulness she used when she wanted something but was trying to ease into it. She asked about my health, my job, my little apartment, clearly fishing for details about my financial situation without seeming obvious. Rebecca posted some lovely photos, she said casually. "Your place looks so spacious. And that view? You must be doing really well at work to afford something so nice." I could practically hear the gears turning in her head, calculating square footage and mortgage payments, trying to figure out exactly how much money her forgotten daughter was making. The conversation felt surreal, 3 years of virtual silence, and now she was suddenly interested in every detail of my life. Dad got on the phone next, and his approach was more direct. He mentioned seeing real estate prices in Seattle on the news and asked if I was comfortable with my mortgage payments. When I mentioned I'd bought the place outright, the silence on the other end was telling. You could almost hear them recalibrating their entire perception of my financial status. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as parental concern. They asked about my job stability, my investment strategies, my future plans. They mentioned how proud they were of my success, conveniently forgetting they'd had no interest in that success when it was happening. They talked about family being important, about how they'd always believed in me, rewriting history with breathtaking audacity. The cherry on top came when they mentioned Derek's temporary setbacks and how the family needed to stick together during tough times. His latest business venture, a food truck that had failed within 6 months, had left him with substantial debt. They'd already remortgaged their house once to help him, and now they were facing the possibility of losing it entirely. As I listened to them talk, I realized this wasn't a reconciliation call, it was a sales pitch. They weren't calling because they missed me or wanted a relationship with their daughter. They were calling because they discovered I had money and they needed money, and surely their successful daughter would want to help her struggling family. The manipulation was so transparent, it was almost insulting. After years of treating me like an afterthought, they expected me to eagerly open my wallet simply because we shared DNA. They'd calculated my net worth based on a few Instagram photos and decided I owed them a financial bailout. What they didn't know was that I'd spent 3 years anticipating this exact moment, imagining how it would feel when they finally came crawling back and planning exactly how I wanted to respond. The 48 hours following that initial phone call were a masterclass in family desperation disguised as love. Text messages started arriving with increasing frequency, photos of old family memories, links to articles about successful children who never forget their roots, and casual mentions of Derek's mounting legal fees and their own financial stress. Mom's texts were particularly manipulative, sharing old photos of me as a child with captions like, "My brilliant baby girl, always knew you'd make us proud," and "Remember when you used to say you'd buy mommy a big house someday?" The audacity was breathtaking. These were the same people who'd missed my college graduation, forgotten my birthday for 3 consecutive years, and couldn't even remember what field I worked in until Rebecca's Instagram post. Derek himself eventually called, and his approach was different but equally calculated. He attempted the sibling bond angle, reminiscing about childhood memories and talking about how he'd always looked up to his genius little sister. He apologized for being distant lately and expressed genuine amazement at my success. His tone carried the practiced sincerity of someone who'd learned to charm his way out of consequences his entire life. "I always knew you were going to be somebody important," he said, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. "Mom and Dad are just so proud, you know. We all are. And I know I haven't been the best brother, but I want to change that. Family should stick together, especially when one of us is killing it like you are." The conversation eventually meandered toward his temporary financial situation. The food truck failure had been devastating, he explained, not because of poor planning or execution, but because of the pandemic and unexpected competition. He owed money to suppliers, had outstanding business loans, and was facing potential bankruptcy. The stress was affecting his health, his relationship, his ability to think clearly about the future. But here's where Derek's approach differed from our parents. He didn't directly ask for money. Instead, he painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control, drowning in debt, through no fault of his own, desperately needing a lifeline, but too proud to ask his successful sister for help. It was manipulation through implied neediness, rather than direct request. I let him talk, asking sympathetic questions and making supportive noises while taking detailed notes about the exact amounts he owed and to whom. His total debt was staggering $39,000 in various business loans, supplier bills, and legal fees. The number felt symbolic somehow, like the universe was putting a price tag on decades of favoritism and neglect. Meanwhile, the extended family gossip network was working overtime. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly reaching out on social media, commenting on old photos, and asking about getting together soon. Aunts were calling with transparent pretenses, fishing for information about my lifestyle and financial situation. The family group chat that I'd muted years ago was suddenly active with people sharing articles about tech industry salaries and Seattle real estate prices. It became clear that my parents had been conducting a full-scale intelligence operation, gathering information about my assets and income from every possible source. They'd learned about my patent royalties from Uncle Pete, who worked in intellectual property law. They'd discovered my consulting rates from a family friend whose company had inquired about my services. They'd even found out about my investment portfolio from a cousin who worked in financial services and had run into my advisor at a conference. The picture they'd assembled was of a daughter who was not just comfortable but genuinely wealthy, someone with the means to solve their problems without significantly impacting her own lifestyle. What they couldn't have known was that I'd been expecting this moment for 3 years and had prepared accordingly. During my therapy sessions after moving to Seattle, my counselor had helped me work through the complex emotions surrounding my family relationships. We'd explored the likelihood that they would eventually reach out, probably motivated by money rather than genuine reconciliation. She'd helped me understand that I had every right to set boundaries and that I didn't owe them financial support simply because they were family. More importantly, she'd helped me realize that I wanted closure, Not reconciliation, but a clear final statement about our relationship that would allow me to move forward without the constant low-level hope that they might change. I wanted them to understand exactly how their favoritism had affected me and to face consequences for their choices. So, when Derek finally called back a week later with a formal request for a $39,000 loan to get back on his feet, I was ready. Derek's official request came during a family conference call that felt like a board meeting. Mom, Dad, and Derek had clearly rehearsed their presentation, taking turns to explain the situation, outline Derek's repayment plan, and emphasize how this loan would benefit the entire family. They painted a picture of a temporary setback that could be resolved with my help positioning me as the family hero who could save the day. Their proposal was actually impressive in its thoroughness. Derek had prepared a detailed business plan for his next venture, a lawn care service that would be recession-proof and guaranteed profitable. He'd researched equipment costs, identified potential clients, and even created a timeline for loan repayment. They presented it like a legitimate investment opportunity rather than a family bailout. Dad took the lead in explaining how proud they were of my success and how they'd always known I was special. He talked about family loyalty, about how the Mitchells had always supported each other through difficult times, about how my success was really their success, because they'd raised me with strong values. The revisionist history was so blatant it was almost entertaining. Mom's contribution focused on emotional manipulation. She talked about sleepless nights worrying about Derek's future, about the stress affecting Dad's health, about how the family was fracturing under financial pressure. She painted me as the only person with the power to restore family harmony and stability. When they finished their presentation, the silence stretched uncomfortably as they waited for my response. I could practically feel their anticipation through the phone, their assumption that of course I would help, that blood was thicker than water, that my success obligated me to share it with family members in need. "I appreciate you putting together such a detailed proposal," I said, finally my voice calm and measured, "and I'm certainly in a position to help. But before I can consider a loan of this magnitude, I need to establish some terms and conditions." Their relief was audible. Dad actually laughed and said he'd expect nothing less from his brilliant daughter and that they were happy to discuss whatever terms I felt were appropriate. They were so focused on getting the money that they didn't seem to recognize the shift in power dynamics that had just occurred. First, I continued, I need to understand exactly why Derek believes he deserves this loan. I'd like him to explain his business experience, his track record of financial responsibility, and what makes him confident this venture will succeed where his previous one failed. Derek launched into a defensive explanation about market conditions and unforeseen circumstances, but I cut him off. I'm not asking about external factors. I'm asking about personal accountability. What role did your own decisions play in the food truck's failure, and what have you learned from that experience? The question clearly caught him off guard. He stammered through a response that blamed everything except his own choices, the location he'd selected, the menu he'd developed, the lack of marketing research he'd conducted. It was classic Derek taking credit for anything positive while deflecting responsibility for negative outcomes. Second, I said I need to discuss the family dynamic that's led to this situation. Mom, Dad, can you help me understand why Derek is asking his sister for a business loan rather than seeking traditional financing through banks or investors? This question created visible discomfort. They explained that Derek's credit history made traditional loans difficult, that banks didn't understand his vision, that family money was safer and came with more flexible terms. What they didn't say, but what we all knew, was that no legitimate lender would approve Derek for $39,000 based on his financial history. That brings me to my third point, I continued. I need to understand what collateral Derek is offering for this loan. What assets would secure my investment, and what happens if the business fails again? The silence that followed was telling. Derek had no assets to offer as collateral. His previous failed ventures had left him with debt rather than equity. He was essentially asking me to make an unsecured loan to someone with a proven track record of business failure and financial irresponsibility. Finally, I said I need to address the elephant in the room. This is the first meaningful conversation we've had in 3 years. Derek, when did you last call me just to check in? Mom, Dad, when did you last ask about my life without needing something from me? The questions hung in the air like an accusation because that's exactly what they were. I was forcing them to confront the transactional nature of their sudden interest in rebuilding our relationship. Sloane, that's not fair, Mom said, her voice defensive. We've always cared about you. We've always been proud of your success. Just because we don't talk every day doesn't mean we don't love you. You're right, I replied. We don't talk every day. We don't talk every month. In fact, the last time any of you called me was to ask for money. So before I can consider this loan, I need to know that our relationship is about more than my bank account. I could hear them conferring in muffled whispers, trying to figure out how to respond to my unexpected conditions. They'd expected me to simply write a check, grateful for the opportunity to finally earn their approval and acceptance. What exactly are you proposing? Dad asked finally. I'm proposing that we rebuild our relationship before we discuss financial arrangements, I said. I want us to have regular family calls to share what's happening in our lives, to act like an actual family. If Derek wants a loan from his sister, then he needs to start acting like a brother. The proposal seemed reasonable on the surface, but I knew it would be impossible for them to maintain. They weren't interested in a relationship with me, they just wanted my money. Forcing them to pretend otherwise would reveal their true motivations and give me the closure I needed. Of course, Derek said quickly. I want that too. We all do. Family is everything. Perfect, I replied. Then here's what we'll do. I laid out my terms with the precision of a corporate contract, each condition designed to expose their motivations, while giving them exactly what they'd asked for, a chance to prove their love was genuine rather than financial. Here's my proposal, I said, enjoying the irony of using Derek's favorite word. For the next 6 months, we'll rebuild our family relationship. Derek, you'll call me every Sunday evening for at least 30 minutes. We'll talk about our weeks, our goals, our lives, real conversations, not just small talk. Mom and Dad, you'll call me every other Wednesday. We'll share what's happening in our lives, discuss family news, and work on actually knowing each other again. I could practically hear them calculating whether 6 months of phone calls was worth $39,000. The math was probably working in their favor, roughly 24 conversations, in exchange for more money than Derek made in a year. During these calls, I continued, I want to hear about Derek's job search, his efforts to address his debt through his own means, and his concrete steps toward financial responsibility. I want to hear about your lives, your interests, your thoughts on things that don't involve money. If we can successfully rebuild our relationship over 6 months, then we'll discuss the loan. The conditions seemed reasonable, even generous. What they didn't realize was that I was giving them enough rope to hang themselves with. 6 months of forced family interaction would reveal whether they were capable of genuine change or if they were simply willing to perform affection in exchange for money. But here's the most important part I added. During these 6 months, Derek needs to demonstrate his commitment to financial responsibility by paying down at least $10,000 of his existing debt through his own efforts. If he can't show progress on his current obligations, then he's not ready for additional financial commitments. This condition was where my plan became truly diabolical. Derek had been unemployed for months, living in our parents' basement, making minimum payments on his debts, while spending money on entertainment and dating. Reducing his debt by $10,000 would require him to get a serious job and fundamentally change his lifestyle, something he'd never shown willingness to do. And if he can do all of that, I concluded, then I'll not only approve the $39,000 loan, but I'll match it with an additional $39,000 as a gift to help ensure his business succeeds. The silence that followed was profound. $78,000 was life-changing money for Derek, enough to launch his business and eliminate his existing debt entirely. But the conditions for earning it were exactly the things he'd spent his entire adult life avoiding: consistent responsibility, genuine effort, and authentic family relationships. That's incredibly generous, Mom said, her voice thick with emotion. Sloane, we're so grateful. We love you so much. I love you too, I replied, and for the first time in years, I meant it. Not because they deserved it, but because I was finally free to love them without expecting anything in return. The next 6 months played out exactly as I'd predicted. The first few calls were awkward but enthusiastic, with everyone trying hard to perform their version of a loving family. Derek talked about job applications and budgeting plans. Mom and Dad shared stories about their hobbies and asked detailed questions about my work. But by month 2, the cracks were showing. Derek's job search was yielding interviews, but no offers, largely because he was only applying for management positions, despite having no relevant experience. His debt reduction consisted of making minimum payments while continuing to spend money on unnecessary purchases. The family calls became increasingly strained as Derek grew frustrated with my questions about his progress. When I asked about specific job applications or debt payments, he became defensive and evasive. When I suggested he might need to consider entry-level positions to gain experience, he accused me of not believing in his potential. By month 3, Derek had found part-time work at a gym, but was already complaining about the hours and the pay. His debt reduction was minimal, and he'd actually added to his credit card balances with necessary purchases for his job search and networking expenses. Month 4 brought the first missed call with Derek, claiming he'd been working late. The next call revealed he'd been fired from the gym job for attendance issues and was considering disability benefits for a mysterious back injury that prevented him from doing physical labor, but not from playing basketball with friends. Mom and Dad's calls followed a similar trajectory. Initial enthusiasm gave way to frustration as they realized I wasn't going to advance any money during the trial period. They began dropping hints about emergency expenses and urgent needs, testing whether I might bend my own rules. By month 5, the facade was crumbling completely. Derek's debt had actually increased, his job search had stalled, and he was openly resentful during our calls. He accused me of setting impossible standards and moving the goalposts, despite my conditions being exactly what I'd outlined from the beginning. The final call came in month 6, 2 weeks early. Derek announced that he'd found an incredible opportunity that required immediate investment, and he needed the loan money right away to avoid missing out. When I reminded him that he hadn't met any of the conditions we'd agreed upon, he exploded. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You're my sister, you have more money than you know what to do with, and you're letting your own brother struggle because of some stupid rules. This isn't about rebuilding relationships. This is about you being controlling and vindictive." Mom and Dad jumped in to support him, arguing that circumstances had changed and that family should be flexible during emergencies. They accused me of being cold and calculating, of holding money over their heads, like a weapon of forgetting where I came from. "You're absolutely right," I said calmly. "I am being controlling and vindictive. I'm also being exactly as transactional as you are. The difference is that I'm honest about it." The conversation that followed was the most authentic one we'd had in years, precisely because all pretense was finally gone. I explained how their favoritism had shaped my childhood, how their neglect had affected my self-worth, and how their sudden interest in my life had nothing to do with love and everything to do with money. I told them about the therapy sessions where I'd worked through the pain of being the forgotten child, about the success I'd achieved, despite their lack of support, about the life I'd built without their involvement or approval. I explained that I didn't need their validation anymore, but I had needed to understand whether they were capable of genuine change. "The loan was never real," I said finally. "I was never going to give Derek $39,000 to start another business. He'd inevitably run into the ground." But I needed to know if you could love me without my money, and now I have my answer. The explosion of anger that followed was both predictable and liberating. They called me selfish, ungrateful, and cruel. They accused me of manipulating them, of playing games with their emotions, of being a terrible daughter and sister. You're right about all of that too, I said. I am manipulative and cruel. I learned from watching how you treated me for 28 years. The difference is that my manipulation served justice, while yours served selfishness. I hung up that night feeling lighter than I had in years. The closure I'd sought was complete, not because we'd reconciled, but because I finally understood our relationship clearly. They weren't capable of loving me without conditions, but I was capable of loving myself without their approval. So here's my question for you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members who only showed up when they needed something? Have you experienced that moment when you realized someone's love was conditional on what you could provide them? I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable toxic behavior, even when it costs you relationships. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama about family dynamics and personal growth. Share this video with anyone who's ever felt like the forgotten child or the family ATM. Sometimes we need to hear that it's okay to choose ourselves over people who don't choose us. Thanks for watching, and remember, family isn't just about blood. It's about love, respect, and showing up for each other consistently, not just when it's convenient. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and don't let anyone make you feel guilty for having boundaries.